thanks for coming today to today's program featuring Graydon Carter and Monica Lewinsky. I'm Andrea Grossman, the founder of Writer's Block, now in our 29th season. Thank you. I want to thank both Graydon and Monica for being here today. Under Graydon's leadership, Vanity Fair spoiled all of us. Only a few years ago, it was a golden age for magazines, and it's fair to say that Vanity Fair ruled the roost for international reach and cultural impact. The Vanity Fair of the Graydon Carter era was unthinkable. Exclusive spreads in a magazine would be unthinkable and unheard of today, featuring 22-page spreads bursting with great photography. This is a book of personal observations that Graydon has written about his relationships that detail how Vanity Fair, one of our most influential publications, came to be a symbol of glamour, scoops, and great investigative and news-breaking reporting. Graydon's keen sensitivity to the needs and demands of enormous personalities clearly make him an ego tamer for those who are living or dead for the ages. Graydon Carter has written a book that represents the best cultural history of a certain moment, a bit of sly gossip and wonderful reflection of a life most magnificently lived. One of my favorite stories in Graydon's new book is how he met a young woman who had been wronged and maligned and needed a sort of reinvention. She needed to rewrite her story. Graydon did just that with and for Monica Lewinsky. Not only was she the subject of a great Vanity Fair profile, which I remember so well, but she found a platform there as well as a writer and a contributing editor. Monica's new podcast called Reclaiming covers serious subjects while being really entertaining. So here's what's going to happen today. Graydon and Monica will chat. Many of you have sent in questions for Graydon, and he and Monica will get to as many of them as he can. Graydon has signed a slew of copies for his terrific book, When the Going Was Good. It makes a great gift for anyone who has ever opened and loved an issue of Spy or Vanity Fair. So please welcome Graydon Carter and Monica Lewinsky.
First, let me thank Writer's Block and Book Soup for hosting this event. So it is such a privilege for me to sit up here today with this man who helped change the course of my life for the better. And I hope that you'll all indulge me for a few minutes as I explain to you why. So we won't get into all the details, but suffice it to say my 20s and 30s sucked. And I found myself at the age of 40 with a tattered reputation, no career prospects, and most important, no voice. That fall of 2013, David Friend, who some of you here may know, who's now my editor at Vanity Fair, took me to a secret meeting at Graydon's private home office. Now, Signal didn't exist back then, but you know, if it had, we probably would have plotted there. I left the meeting with two good pieces of information. One, Graydon Carter wanted to help me attempt to reclaim my narrative. And two, the name Anthony Gordon Lennox, which I'll get to in a second. So I was gonna break my decade of silence with a first-person essay in Vanity Fair. And that was only if my writing was good enough, according to Graydon. But he could have been ridiculed for trying to give Punchline another 15 minutes of fame, but he took the risk. And I know his beautiful wife, Anna, who's here today, was encouraging of it. So in May of 2014, Graydon published my essay, Shame and Survival. Thank God it was not a flop. And more than anything, it ignited a sea change in how people evaluated or reevaluated me and my story. And it literally changed my life. So, as a result of the essay, I was asked to speak at the Forbes 30 Under 30 conference, and the problem was I was basically a public speaking virgin. So Graydon and a few others stepped in to help again and connected me to a Brit, Anthony Gordon Lennox, who ran AGL Communications. So little Eliza Doolittle here went off to London, of course with a beret. But from Ant, I gained confidence skills and found my public speaking voice. And while Ant very sadly passed away at a young age in 2017, his sister, Lucy Cornell, who is a dear friend of the Carters and mine, is here today, which makes this event even more meaningful for all of us. So Graydon,
Monica,
from my whole family and I, thank you for your kindness, your generosity, and bravery in both changing my life and saving it.
oh, you're a doll. No, you're an absolute dearest person, and I felt so terrible when this originally happened because I have 5 kids, 2 of them daughters, and I thought if this happened to one of them, I would be livid. And so, no, you've reclaimed your life, you've done this yourself, and I'm really happy for you and really proud of you.
Oh, thank you. But let's pivot now to talk about your memoir, When the Good Was Going.
When the Going
no,
Was Good.
When the Going Was Good. Shit, I already,
Although a friend of mine,
already messed up.
a friend of mine said only a Canadian would say when the going was good. She said an American would say when the going was great. So.
Exactly. So what made you want to write a memoir now?
I'd never thought of it. I was ever, and I was having lunch in London with a friend of mine, James Fox, who's an esteemed journalist. He wrote White Mischief. He helped Keith Richards write his memoir, Life. And he said, if you ever decide to write a memoir, I'd love to help guide you through it. And I thanked him for it, and I didn't think much of it. And then gradually things came together, and we started working on it, and we had a great time together. I'm not a solitary person. I like having a partner. I've had a partner in almost all my endeavors. And James was very much my partner. And we worked out on it. I'd retired. We were in France. He came to our place in Connecticut. We worked on it in New York and in London. And it was a very deep friendship to begin with, and became even deeper as we went along. And here we are.
Yeah. What did you find was the hardest part or the most challenging of writing a memoir?
Well, and trying to figure out the order of a memoir is very difficult because you can't do the whole thing in a linear fashion. And this is where James was instructive. He was very good at saying we've got to start off with something and then move to, and then it can go linear for a while, but then you're going to have to stop from periods like here and there. And he would tell me what was boring and what was not, which was highly useful.
Hard to imagine.
Hopefully we put the not in the book.
Boring that you
well,
said.
no, you'd be surprised.
Okay, I want to go to something juicy right off the bat.
Okay.
Can you tell us a scandalous story that might have been cut from the book because illegal without using names?
Well, when I first came to Time magazine in the 1970s, the expense accounts were extraordinary, and I'd never had one before. And so there was vast expense account stories that became part of the office lore. And there was one writer, and he had come from Sports Illustrated, and the managing editor asked him to go cover the Pope, who was making a visit to Mexico. And he was the only practicing Catholic on the staff, and that's why they wanted him for it. But he didn't want to go, so he made up on the spot. He said I was going to take my family to Maine for a little fall family holiday. And the managing editor said, well, send your family to Maine and expense the cost, and you cover the Pope. So he goes, okay. So he covers the Pope. He gets home. His family had been at home the entire time. So he goes to a stationer in Princeton, New Jersey, and has letterhead and envelope voices made up for something called Whispering Pines or something like that. And in granular detail, he makes the expenses for like a week's stay at this fictitious inn. So he submits all of that. It gets paid. So he's cleaning out his desk a couple of days later, and he finds the invoice from the stationery for the that he'd had the stuff printed on, and he expensed that, and that was paid. So I had this. It's in my book, but originally I had the writer's name in, and the lawyer said, "Best take his name out." I took out. There were things I didn't put in. I don't put in feuds because I think feuds date a book very quickly, and also since if I'm writing about a feud that I'm having with somebody, obviously I'm giving only my side of the story, and it's not fair to them. So.
Wow, that's very magnanimous of you, Graydon.
Yeah.
So before you became a titan of New York media world, what were you like as a child? Who was little Graydon Carter? Were you, curious about people, culture, media still?
Not curious about people so much as curious about the world outside Ottawa. I grew up. Ottawa is a very cold capital city in Canada. The snow was astounding. You can't believe how much snow there was. We would play hockey on open rinks when it was 30 below zero with old-fashioned skates, not quite Hans Brinker, but sort of old leather skates. And when I was growing up, we play hockey. You had no padding from the neck up, so there's nothing on your neck. There was no helmets. There were no face guards, and I loved hockey and I loved skiing. But I thought, when I turned about 13, I thought most of the friends I knew who were 15, 16 who played hockey, they're missing a few of their front teeth. And I thought, I have no idea what I'm going to do in my life, but I think teeth are going to be vital to the mission. I have all my teeth. But I was a normal kid, and my parents had subscriptions to a lot of magazines, and I read Time and Life and The New Yorker and Esquire. And for I had just this insane gravitational pull to New York City, both from the magazines, from the movies I loved, and I had no idea how to affect that 700-mile move from Ottawa, which is on the American-Canadian border, and New York.
Mm-hmm. Well, before we jump from Ottawa to New York, the first excerpt from the book appeared in the Atlantic magazine, and it was all about working on the Canadian Railroad. So Graydon Carter, a linesman on the Canadian Railroad. Can you tell us more?
Well, so a lot of middle-class families, they would send their very soft, unmuscled children out west to do some labor to sort of toughen them up, get them out of their hair for a while. And so I was talked into it. And I had an aunt who was a vice president of the Canadian National Railway. And so I went out and went 1,300 miles west, and you go to this vast rail yard called the Symington Yard in Winnipeg. Winnipeg is sort of the Chicago of Canada. And you're going through a health inspection to make sure that you feel you're up to speed. And there's a chart on the wall I noticed when we were giving like urine samples and things like that, and it had what they would pay if you lost certain body parts. So it'd be like $750 for a leg, $250 for an arm, $150 for a foot, and these are in Canadian dollars, and which are worth about 75% of an American dollar. But I spent, I wound up living in a boxcar with 11 other men, all of them older than me. Most of them had criminal records, usually quite minor, like Grand Theft Auto. And I grew to love these people, and I learned how to overcome my fear of heights. It was a great experience. And actually, my best friend at the time, Bruce McLennan, also happened to work in the railroad at the time. And at one point, we met up on the lonely stretch of prairie. And, I was a bit lonely at the time, and he was, but we had to sort of say hello for like 15 seconds and then goodbye. But when I came back, I just knew that I wanted to get on with my life, and I wanted to, have a job where you shower at the beginning of the day and wear a tie. When I was a kid, I didn't want to extend my adolescence like a lot of young people do. I wanted to become an adult. I wanted an adult life of cigarettes and cocktails and ties and jackets and bridge games and witty banter and New York.
And your teeth and all your limbs.
And with all my teeth.
Well, you say in the book, quote, New York was always a magazine city for me. Growing up in Canada, magazines, like you mentioned, Life, Look, Esquire, The New Yorker, and Time, more than anything else, told me the story of the city. So can you talk about the magic of New York for you and when you first arrived in 1978? I was 5.
78. No, and I came to New York. I'd had a magazine in college in Canada, and it was a literary political magazine, and it wasn't very good. It was put out by people who had never worked at a magazine before, which is really evident if you ever picked up a copy. But we kept it going for 5 years. We eventually sold it to our closest competitor, and I got a job at Time magazine, which was then this huge empire. There must have had 800 employees for one magazine. And so I arrived in 1978 and on one of the hottest days I'd ever experienced in my life. And New York in '78, it was like burned out cars everywhere. It was prostitution, graffiti, drug addicts at every corner. But I was so excited just to be in New York, and I got off the plane, and I only had Canadian clothes, and that was I had a very heavy tweed jacket, and I arrived in the middle of July. It was so hot, and this is the days when you walk down the plank onto the tarmac, and I literally just hit me like this. But I spent 3 days in the city. This is when I was looking for a job. I spent 3 days in the city, got the job at Time, and then came back in September. And I was so happy, I can't even tell you. I had an apartment in the village that I paid $200 a month rent on. It had a garden, and I had these expense accounts, and I was surrounded by incredibly smart people. Frank Rich, who produced Succession, Michiko Kakutani, the chief book critic of the Times, Maureen Dowd, who was here just a couple of weeks ago, Alessandra Stanley, my partner at Airmail, who became the Rome and Moscow bureau chief for the New York Times, my partner at Spy magazine, Kurt Anderson, Walter Isaacson, Jim Kelly, and Rick Stengel, both of whom became editors of Time. So this is what I came into, and I thought, God, are all Americans this smart and this together? And it was an education.
Did I hear you just say that you got the job at Time, that you got your first job in New York City within 3 days?
Within 3 days, yes.
Wow, that's really impressive.
Well, they usually Time in those days took 6 months to hire somebody, but I was in the interview with Ray Cave, who's the managing editor, and he said, "Okay, let's talk in 6 months." And I did something. Time's a pretty buttoned-down place, and I did something I can't believe I did. I put my hand on his arm. I said, "No, I need a job now." And so, a few hours later, I was staying with a friend on a 4-floor walk-up on 14th Street, and I was getting up to the top of the stairs, and the phone rang, and it was his deputy saying, "Can you start on Monday?" So,
wow.
Yeah, the hand gesture did everything.
You mentioned Kurt Anderson. So can you, you and Kurt cooked up the idea of Spy Magazine. Can you tell us a little about how that came about?
Well, I went on, after Time, I went to work at Life magazine, and Kurt was at Time. He was doing a lot better at Time than I was at Life. But then I thought, I got to get out of here, and I sort of started thinking about this magazine that I'd had a few ideas for. A magazine about New York, but with funny, pointed journalism. Not humor, but funny journalism. And so I asked Kurt if he'd be interested in being my partner. And he said yes, and we started working at it in my office at Life magazine. And nobody seemed to find it suspicious that a writer from Time was spending 4 or 5 hours a day in my Life office. And then eventually we had a third partner, Tom Phillips, who had been a banker at Rothschild, and he joined us as well. So there'd be like 2 other people in my office, and the office was not large. This is like something out of a night at the opera, the stateroom scene. And so, but we'd work on the magazine. We plotted it out. We went out raising money from my office at Life, and we raised like, I don't know, I think $3 million to start it. It was a lot of money at the time.
Yeah. In the book, you say, quote, editing Spy was like carpet bombing at 25,000 feet. There were some great stunts that you pulled. Who were some of your most memorable targets?
Well, New York in the time we started, which was the mid-1980s, happened to be just a perfect time. This was not planned or in any way that we would hit it at this moment. But New York had come out of bankruptcy. There were fewer burnt-out cars everywhere. This new occupation, investment banker, had sort of arisen out of the ground. And you had the ladies who lunch, up on the Upper East Side. You had bankers making incredible amounts of money, and a lot of people just wanted to show off this new money they had. So regular characters were people like Leona Helmsley, whose husband was a big real estate person. She was a slight monster, and Donald Trump, who was then making like a permanent place for himself in the New York City tabloids, and we came up with funny epithets for people at Spy. We called Henry Kissinger a socialite. We called Henry Kissinger a socialite war criminal, which he's never quite looked at me in a kindly way since then. We called Donald Trump a short-fingered vulgarian, which drives him crazy to this day. And Larry Tisch bought CBS. And he's a real estate developer in New York, and he bought CBS, and he started firing all the news employees. So we did a story on that, but we called him a dwarf billionaire in the magazine. I know this is very politically incorrect now, but we called him a dwarf billionaire in the magazine. And a very good friend of mine, John Scanlon, called me at the day the magazine hit the newsstand, and he was working for Larry at the time. He just calls me, just screaming at me. He said, "Graydon, you've gone too far." He said. And I had my phone cradled in and I always kept a pencil beside me. And he said, "You've gone too far, Graydon." He said, "First of all, Larry is not technically a dwarf." So I wrote that down. And the next month, we printed a correction pointing out that a CBS factotum had called and said that Larry is not technically a dwarf. And Scanlon called me even angrier after that. So anyway, there were a lot of colorful, slightly annoying characters at the time. And then one time, a friend of mine, friend Steve Probin, who was working for Margaret Thatcher at the time, he said, "I've got an idea for you." He said, "Why don't you try to get really rich New Yorkers to sign really small checks?" So I thought, that's a great idea. So we came up with a company called a National Check Return Company, a corporation, had the checks made up. So we sent out to 100 rich wealthy New Yorkers. We sent out checks for 32 cents to see who would take the trouble to sign their names on the back and deposit them. And about 50% signed the 32-cent check. The ones who didn't, we sent them checks for 64 cents to see if that would do the trick. The ones who did sign the 32-cent check, we sent them checks for 16 cents. So they, this takes months and months in those days. You had to wait for the checks to come back, and they had to remail the stuff out. So finally, it came down to the end. This is after almost a year's work. It came down to the end, and two people had signed the 16-cent check. One was Adnan Khashoggi, who was then the world's biggest arms trader, and Donald Trump. And we couldn't believe our luck.
But looking back, were there any moments that you maybe thought you went a little too far, or was that always the point of shaking up the status quo?
We sort of went after overdogs, so if we did go too far, it's not like we were picking on little people. I'm sure there are instances where we did go too far. There are people who still will never speak to me again, like Lally Weymouth, who's like one of the Washington Post, she's the Washington Post heiress. But by and large, we did some things like anytime we ran a photograph of Ralph Lauren, the picture would be about this big on the page, and we'd write "not actual size" beside it. And I'm sure that just drove him crazy.
You think?
And he became one of my biggest advertisers at Vanity Fair. So anyway, it's just, we probably did go too far, but most of these things are lost to the sands of time, I think, at this point.
Now, Gore Vidal threatened to sue Spy magazine for ironically being called litigious. What was your relationship like with him?
Well, yeah, this was my first introduction to Gore, and we'd done a story on the 10 most litigious New Yorkers, and Gore was living in New York at the time. And someone got my phone number. He calls. We were in the book actually. So he calls me up and said, "I want you to retract the fact that you called me a one of the most litigious New Yorkers." I said, "Yeah." He said, "If you don't, I'm going to sue you." I said, I said, "Okay, you're kidding, right?" So anyway, flash forward 10 years, and I'm at Vanity Fair. And Gore, who is like one of the greatest novelists and essayists of the last 60 years, I wanted to write for the magazine. So he comes on and he becomes a writer at Vanity Fair. But he was constantly getting into scrapes with some of the other writers. And I liked people to sort of work together and like be convivial and appreciate each other. So he gets into a fight with Dominic Dunn. And this goes on for a few months, and I organize a makeup dinner. So they make up. And then he gets into a fight with Christopher Hitchens. And so, again, another makeup dinner, everything. And I brought Dominic to that one, and so that everything gets to where. Then in the aughts, he gets into spats with me. And it just sort of, our relationship sort of dwindled a bit. And a few years later, we were sailing off the Amalfi Coast with some friends, and he invited us up to see him in Ravello at his house on the cliff. It's a beautiful house, I mean, extraordinary. His boyfriend, Howard, had died recently, and we thought, I can go up and I can restart our friendship. So we were having drinks, and I said I needed to go to the bathroom. So I go into the bathroom, and I'm peeing, and there's a little window right on the side with 4 panes and one of those metal handles it was a metal frame. And I thought, I'm going to see what it looks like outside the window while I'm peeing. So I open it up. It comes out of the whole casement. So the window, I hold onto the handle, but I'm holding this whole window. It's completely out of the casement, but I'm peeing at the same time. So I can't hold the thing without using both hands. So I have to reach over and grab the window. And Gore, I've been in there about 3 minutes, and I'm really starting to sweat. Gore pounds the door. He says, "Everything okay in there?" I said, "Yeah, no, it's all fine." So I finished what I was doing with my right hand, and we get the window, and I slowly managed to get it back into the casement. And there's some toothpaste, and I used some toothpaste to sort of caulking along the edge. But because I'd made such a mess of things, my pants were a little damp. And so I was in there for about 15 minutes, and I come out, and he takes a look at me. He takes a look at my pants, and anyway, the friendship never quite resumed the way I was hoping it would.
I was hoping you were going to say that, oh, did you try and open the window? So
No. No, yeah.
I can't imagine you were the only one, right?
No. Oh, my, yes.
But so Spy magazine was known for its biting humor and fearless takedowns of rich, powerful, and famous people. In fact, in the inaugural issue, you had a feature that was Jerks, the 10 most embarrassing New Yorkers. How did Spy's approach to celebrity culture shape your work at Vanity Fair, if at all?
Well, the celebrity culture of Vanity Fair is basically, I always thought of the cover as basic gift wrapping. You wanted to, movie stars are better looking than we are. They look nicer on covers. They look nicer on a magazine on your coffee table. So the movie stars were basically a way to get them to sell the magazine. And Vanity Fair, unlike most major monthly magazines, had one edition that went around the world in the same form. I mean, there's a different Vogue in every single country of the world, but we had one cover that went around the world. And the sort of lingua franca of the global newsstand were movie stars. If you're Tom Hanks, you're a movie star here, and you're a movie star in Myanmar. So I thought, I had somebody on staff, fortunately, who was a wrangler and sort of invented the job of wrangler. Her name is Jane Sarkin. And she managed to, I had to make some outreaches to people like Michael Ovitz, who was then the most powerful person in Hollywood, who absolutely hated me. We had a monthly column about him when we were at Spy. That at one point he hired a private detective to try to find out who was writing these columns. But I had a lunch with him we didn't wind up being friends or anything like that, but I sort of, hopefully the relationship sort of neutralized a bit. But I never bought into the celebrity culture that much. I was more interested in the journalism, but I knew how important it was to have a quality movie star on the cover to get it off the newsstand.
Oh, interesting. So I think, as you're talking about Vanity Fair, most of our audience remembers you as the legendary editor of Vanity Fair. But when you met Cy Newhouse of Condé Nast in 1992, that wasn't the job that you were offered first. Can you tell us that story?
Well, after we sold Spy to a man called Johnny Pagazzi and Charles Saatchi, the famous ad man. And after about 6 months working for them, I left and became the editor of this little sleepy newspaper on the Upper East Side called the New York Observer. And it was a broadsheet. It looked a bit like the New York Times. It was on salmon-colored paper. And so I thought I had worked out a plan, like a 6-month, 12-month, 18-month plan of how I'd get it to be readable and sort of make it a thing. And so after about 9 months, all of a sudden it was being read and people liked it and it was catching on. And so I started sending copies to editors I knew in Europe and in America. And Cy Newhouse, who then, he was the most potent force in sort of public culture. He ran Random House and Knopf, and he had Condé Nast with all these magazines. He was the most powerful person in the culture at that point. So he makes an annual, twice a year, trip of all his properties in Europe. And he stops up in London and Paris and Milan, and he sees copies of the New York Observer in all his editors' inboxes. So he comes back from Europe thinking, this is an international hit. And it wasn't in any stretch. So he asked me if I'd like to meet with him, and he offered me 2 magazines, The New Yorker and Vanity Fair, and I almost had a heart attack. And I said, well, the trouble is we've made incredible fun of Vanity Fair, the editor of Vanity Fair, the contributors, the house style of writing, and I thought it might be, so he said, okay, The New Yorker then. And so we agreed on that, and I work on a plan for that. And then the day was supposed to be announced. Anna Wintour calls me up and said, it's going to be the other magazine. I said, what do you mean? He said, just act surprised when he calls you, the other magazine. So I said, okay. So Cy calls me a few minutes later. He says, Vanity Fair, is that okay? I said, I needed the money so desperately. We had children, and I had 3 kids at that point, and we desperately needed the money. I said, absolutely, I'd love it. So that's how I wound up at Vanity Fair.
So you arrive at Vanity Fair, and in the book you write, quote unquote, going from Spy to Vanity Fair was like moving from a youth hostel to a 5-star hotel. How so?
Well, at Spy, we sometimes, once we ran out of money, and Kurt and I had to write almost the entire issue ourselves under different pseudonyms. I mean, we had no money ever, and at the Observer, we had almost no money. So coming to Vanity Fair, I mean, it was like, I had a bathroom that was so beautiful that a friend came up one day from the New Yorker, and she looked at my bathroom, she goes, oh my God, this is like Mitzi Gaynor's bathroom. And I had 2 assistants, there was a car and driver, there was a woman in a maid's uniform, it would come in and make coffee for me every 3 or 4 hours. I'd never experienced anything like this. But at the same time, the job was to make a great magazine that would make good profits for the company. So Cy wasn't just throwing money out the window. There was method in his madness, because when I came to New York, there were 3 tiers of magazine companies. There was Time Incorporated on top with Time and Sports Illustrated and Fortune and People and a number of other titles. There was Hearst that had Harper's Bazaar and Esquire. And there was Condé Nast down at the bottom, and it was more considered a sort of finishing school magazine company where, a lot of women wouldn't even cash their checks. People would find them in their desk drawers, all their paychecks for the past year, because they didn't need the money. But Cy, he took over the company when he was in his 40s, and he systematically built it up. He bought the New Yorker. He bought magazines like GQ and Architectural Digest and Gourmet, and he relaunched Vanity Fair in 1983, which was one of the biggest relaunches of any magazine ever. Vanity Fair had been around, had been run in America between 1913 and 1936, but it was very much the jazz age magazine, but it had fallen out of step because it didn't take the rise of Hitler and Nazism seriously, and it seemed very out of date by 1936, and he had, Condé Nast, the man, had folded it into Vogue. And so when Psy relaunched Vanity Fair in 1983, that was the biggest magazine event of my life in New York, and I've been there almost 50 years. What was the question? I've forgotten. Oh, Psy. We were talking about Psy. So anyway, Psy was the greatest proprietor of any cultural endeavor. He loved books and he loved magazines, and that is vital in an owner. And he gave his editors everything they could possibly need to be successful. If you weren't successful with all that he gave you, it wasn't his fault, it was your fault. And he liked magazines to have influence and also to make money. And so he was very generous we were generous to the photographers. I mean, at one point, I was negotiating with Annie Leibovitz and her agent, and I was having lunch with Psy, and he said, "How's that going?" And I said, "Look, we're $250,000 a year apart." And Psy just thought for a moment, he said, "Give it to me." He said, "I don't want to nickel and dime them." And I thought, that was the magazine business in those days. And you flew the Concorde to Europe, and anyway, it was predicated on you putting out a good magazine.
Yeah. Well, you were at the helm of Vanity Fair for 25 years. And what was the most important shift that you made to the magazine during the tenure? And how did you balance maintaining both a legacy while also pushing it into the future?
Oh, interesting. So because I knew in the history of Vanity Fair, that Vanity Fair in the 30s had not made the shift to become a more serious magazine. And the New Yorker, which had been its competitor in the 30s, and very much a smart set magazine, had made the shift. In fact, the New Yorker's reputation basically started during World War II with great reportage, and that cemented its legacy forever. So I knew for instance, after 9/11, that was a major tectonic shift in the culture, and it had to be in magazines. So, we did, huge stories on the war. We were the only major magazine in the country, month after month, that was against the invasion of Iraq. Almost every other editor was for the war. And it's the one time I had a dispute with Psy because he was pro-war, and he thought I was getting boring on the subject, but we laid off for a month or two, and then came back to it because I had two teenage boys at that time, and I thought, I'm damned if I'm going to let one of them go off to fight a country that had nothing to do with these attacks over oil. I'd rather ride a bicycle for the rest of my life.
That's so interesting.
And then we made another shift, and after the financial crash of 2008, and I happened to have some of the greatest business journalists alive: Bethany McLean, William D. Cohan, Michael Lewis, and Brian Burrow, and that was one of the great periods of our life, is doing that sort of 3-year mop-up after the financial crisis. And the financial crisis destroyed a lot of things. That outraged me that the savings and loan crisis that happened in the early 90s, something like 900 people went to jail. After the subprime mortgage crisis of 2008, not a single person went to jail for it.
That's still shocking. Still shocking. What do you consider the recipe for a successful story at Vanity Fair and now also at Airmail?
Well, I do think, we had stories that would run between, say, 10,000, 8,000 up to 20,000 words. And not all writers are capable of doing that sort of thing, because you need a narrative arc. You need a beginning, middle, and end. And our stories would come out after the news reports in the newspapers and before the books. So I wanted writers who could tell those stories, but you need a narrative arc for a story to run any length. You need conflict is really important. You want two people or two countries or two companies fighting over the same thing. That's essential. You need access to the principles or the people on the edge of the periphery of the principles, and you need disclosure. That is, you're going to have to give out information that has not been there before. So you advance the scholarship on any given topic. So if you have those four elements, you have a good chance of pulling off something great.
That's really interesting. You've also worked with some of the biggest names in Hollywood, politics, and fashion. So how did you decide whom to put on the cover, and what did you look for in someone that would make a good fit for Vanity Fair?
For the cover, I wanted people of quality whose careers I thought would last a long time rather than sort of hot flash in the pans. And so that was a deciding factor. And you know, we made a lot of mistakes along the way. There were people who disappeared almost immediately after the cover was printed. But by and large, we were good at that. That's where I spent the time on with regards to the covers. And but I had a staff just to do the covers.
Was there ever anyone that you really wanted to get on the cover that you couldn't?
No.
Wow.
No, we were the dominant magazine of the culture, and it wasn't that difficult to get people.
Yeah.
I wish there was somebody, but no.
Okay. What were some of the biggest challenges, though, that you faced as editor at Vanity Fair? And was there ever a moment where you sort of thought, this is bigger than me?
Well, no, it wasn't. You know, the thing is, it wasn't reason. It was the golden age of magazines from like probably the early 1960s till 2010, let's say. And it was a golden age of magazines. A major reason was that magazines were really good. All magazines. I mean, you know, gardening magazines were good. Cooking magazines were good. So if you were an editor during that period, the competition was fierce. It's like with the studio system here in Los Angeles in the 1930s. All the studios were cooking because they were so competitive with each other. So my competition was both, weekly. There were a lot of weekly competitors, and also monthlies. But the weeklies, they come out 4 times a month, and a monthly is a cumbersome process. If I started a story in May, it might take the journalist 3 months to report the story. It would take us a month and a half to edit the story, fact check the story, lay out the story, photograph the story, put it through legal review. Then it takes 3 weeks to print the magazine. Then you've got to distribute it to wholesalers around the country. And then it goes to individual retailers. And so story ordered up in May had to be current in September. And that was the hard part, is finding stories that would have long shelf lives. And so it was, and you're worried that one of the weekly competitors is going to do a better job and get it out first. So that was every single day.
Oh my gosh. Do you think that, I mean, not that there aren't still some good magazines around, but you were just saying that every magazine at the time really was sort of top quality. Do you think it was the kind of proliferation of more and more new magazines coming out that sort of changed the structure of, not structure, but changed how magazines were seen and the quality that was happening?
Well, there was a magazine for everybody. I mean, there were so many magazines started up in the 1980s, and it was just a very fertile time. But when young people that go in and start up some .com thing or an app or whatever they do now, they wanted to start magazines in the 1980s or work at magazines. Magazines were considered a sort of glamorous, segment of the cultural firmament, and so. It was just a wonderful time, and advertisers, this is before the internet, before they discovered, all this targeting advertising on the internet, magazines were a way to reach the audience they wanted to reach, and until they weren't.
Yeah. How did you deal with the fact that some of the stories you were going to cover included controversy and might piss off powerful people?
That didn't bother me at all. We were doing a story on Marie Brenner, who's a brilliant journalist, was doing a story on Jeffrey Wigand, who was the Brown and Williamson whistleblower. He was a scientist at Brown and Williamson, and he brought detailed information to the public that Brown and Williamson and all the other major tobacco companies have been hiding the negative, harmful effects of and the addictive effects of what they made. And so Jeffrey Wigand was this very complicated whistleblower, and all of a sudden, 60 Minutes was doing a story on him, and then it was canceled. And so I signed Marie to do this story, and as it happened, somebody had dropped a 400-page document on Jeffrey Wigand with the editors of the Wall Street Journal and the producers of 60 Minutes. And as it turned out, the person who did this was our friend John Scanlon, the guy who used to work for Larry Tisch, the dwarf billionaire. And, well, he's not a dwarf billionaire, technically. And so, and John was on my masthead as a PR advisor. So I had to ask him to step down, and I would never go after a friend, but if you wind up with your hand in the news chipper, there's not much I could have done about it. And so that was tough. Anytime involved a friend who was on the edge of a story, but the things of the White House or all the rest of that, no, that's fair game.
Wait, so are you saying would you warn a friend if they were on the edge of something, or you just...
No, I wouldn't warn a
church
friend.
and
I wouldn't warn a friend. I would just. This is really the only time where a really close friend was involved in a major news story that we were working on.
Okay. So you're known for cultivating a specific kind of voice at Vanity Fair, and it was sharp, witty, often irreverent. How much of that tone was something that you consciously developed versus just reflecting your own personality?
Oh no, I think at Spy magazine we wanted a sort of unified voice for the magazine, and because that hadn't really been done in America before, everybody had usually it's a chorus of voices. So my partner Kurt and I, we sort of worked on the voice very much in the first 3 issues, and we spent hours editing stories so that it have this unified, slightly detached, judgmental, but funny voice. And finding journalists who could get the story and write funny was difficult, but we managed to pull some together. So we create the voice in the first 3 months, and then we just hoped the writers would parody that for the rest of the time, which they did. So when I came to Vanity Fair, there was a very Baroque style of writing that just drove me crazy. I mean, a restaurant wasn't a restaurant, it was a boîte. A book wasn't a book, it was a tome. It was all so flowery, and I got rid of it. That way I made a list of about 200 names, and we consigned them to the graveyard that they could never appear in the magazine. And it's a list I've taken with me to airmail as well. They're just words that just drive me crazy.
Well, can you share some of the things on the list?
Well, at Vanity Fair, somebody wouldn't say something funny. They would chortle or guffaw, and I'd say, no, you can't have that. And I used to edit manuscripts with a pencil. I never edited one story on a computer when I was at Vanity Fair. And quite often, some of the writers, the margins would just be black with changes, because I almost thought they were like punking me by trying to throw in as many of the words that were on the ban list as possible. But we did get a change. So in 6 months, I sort of brought it down to a voice that I was comfortable with.
And do you have a favorite story that you published, other than mine, obviously?
Oh, than yours. Well, there's so many wonderful stories, but there's one that this writer called George Gurley did, and he came to me and he said he did a story for us on something I'd never heard of up to that point, and they were called plushies and furries. And these are people who are most comfortable wearing furry animal costumes, and they like to have sex in these animal costumes. And the animal costumes have strategic holes in them to have sex. And they have a convention. And so it was just such an out there story. One of my favorite stories is a story that I actually turned down, and Buzz Bissinger, who's a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist, who wrote Friday Night Lights, and he wrote for me on a million different stories. But his editor came to me and said, Buzz wants to write about his addiction to Gucci clothes. And I said, that doesn't sound like anything to be right for us. It's more like a men's service magazine sort of thing. Maybe you should take it to GQ. Well, he did take it to GQ, and then the story came out. I thought it was one of the most compelling, interesting articles I'd ever read in my life. Because it's not just an addiction. He had spent $750,000 in 1 year on Gucci clothing. And when I met him, he was a very buttoned-down Ivy Leaguer with a Brooks Brothers shirt and a rep tie and a blazer. And by the end of the $750,000 period, I saw him in New York, and he had like a mesh shirt on, which is not a look for anybody, and leather trousers and a leather jacket. And I missed. It was the best story. It was one of the most interesting stories I'd ever read, and I could have published it, but I didn't.
You're talking about furries reminds me, I learned what that word was from when I watched 12 Angry Men, and apparently...
Which word?
Furries.
Oh, furry.
Yeah, from the plushies and furries.
Right.
So, oh
okay.
well, never mind. It's not funny. It's
okay.
okay.
No, I didn't.
Next question.
Okay. No, it's okay.
There's been a lot of talk about the death of privacy in the modern celebrity world. Do you think that we've gone too far in that regard, or was it inevitable and that we'd move into this new era of constant access to celebrities?
I'm not on Instagram or anything like that, but I see the compilations, the New York Post every Sunday of all the people who put their pictures on it. People are out there doing it themselves. You don't need anybody else to do it. I think that if you want privacy, you can live a private life. For a bunch of us here, the most famous movie star when we were growing up and going to the movies was Robert Redford. And Robert Redford kept a private life. And I defy anybody to know anything about what the great swath of his private life was. You can lead a private life if you want to. If you want to be out there, you got to take the brickbacks as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, the Vanity Fair Oscar party has become legendary in its own right, thanks to you. What inspired you to create it, and how did it evolve into the major cultural event that it is today?
Well, I was in my first 2 years of Vanity Fair were really tough. The staff, the leftover staff hated me. The readers were retreating. Advertisers were in revolt, and so there was a lot going on. But Swifty Lazar had invited me to his Oscar party, because he invented the Oscar party. And I went, and it was in Spago, and he had an A and B room, and I was in the B room. The A room was for the Gregory Pecks and the Jimmy Stewarts and that sort of thing. But I saw what he did, and then he dies in December. So I thought I needed something to dig me out of this hole I was in. And I thought, this might be interesting. This might be something we could take over. And so we did the first Oscar party that spring in March. The Oscars used to be in March. But I wanted to do it in a small way in case we failed, because I think best not to fail in front of a vast audience, best to fail in front of as few eyes as possible. So we invited we did it at Morton's, the old restaurant in Beverly Hills. And we invited 150 people for dinner, and it was great with people like Mick Jagger and David Hockney and Prince. And anyway, and then we had 150 people come afterwards from the Oscars. And so that went reasonably well. So the next year, we upped it a bit, and it just grew and grew. And then it became the problem of trying to keep people out of the party, because we were limited to wherever we held it, to a certain number of people. And the Beverly Hills Fire Marshal stands by the door with a clicker. So he'll click, every time somebody comes in, he clicks it, and as soon as it gets to a different number, he blocks the door. So we had to schedule people in their time so that not everybody flooded in there at once, and we got shut down. Meanwhile, I wanted as many movie stars per square inch in that room as I could humanly get. And I wanted everybody from the Oscars to come with their Oscars. So we had like a speed lane if you had an Oscar, just like and you just get right in. And so it was. I loved the preparation. It's a long night at the office, because I would stand outside. I like when you go to somebody's house or go to a party, if the host is near the front and sort of welcomes you and you feel sort of welcome, and because everybody's sort of anxious when they go out. And so I would stand out front for the people coming to dinner, often with Cy Newhouse and his wife Victoria, and Cy's brother Donald and his wife Sue. So there's 4 of them, and they didn't know that many people coming to dinner. So some nights I would have to make 600 introductions before we sat down. So I have great social anxiety. I would take a half a beta blocker and a shot of vodka, and I'd get through that period. And then the whole question was just pacing myself through the whole night. So, but I sort of grew to love it, but the happiest moments for me was getting in the car and going home to my wife and kids. Well, they would be with us, you know. So.
Yeah, no, I was very shocked when you first told me that you had a lot of anxiety, social anxiety about hosting the parties, because I had been a few times and never would have guessed that in a million years.
Beta blocker. And also, I think it's really important for the host to look like they're having a great time. You've got to, if you fake it, it means it sort of gives them license to have a great time,
right,
rather than the host, being all nervous and huddling in the corner, which is exactly what I wanted to do.
So you don't strike me as someone who would be easily starstruck. But were you ever? Was there anybody who came to the parties that you just thought, wow?
Not the sort of people you'd expect. I remember being very excited when I met Billy Wilder. I remember the first time I had dinner with Sue Mengers. It was at Ray Stark's house, and I thought I knew everything about Sue at that point, not in a stalkery way, but I just knew about her, and we became lifelong friends after that dinner. And not starstruck, but impressed with people. And most people who are movie stars, if they're at the top for a long period of time, you know something? They're really nice people, because if you're a horrible person, you're going to fall at some point, unless you're just so unbelievably talented, and nobody is that talented that if they're horrible, they can survive. So most people at the top are really nice people.
Before we switch over to some of the audience questions, I just want to do what you made famous, the Proust questionnaire lightning round.
Okay.
Well, I guess Proust made his own.
Okay. Yes.
Famous,
Yes.
But you know.
Well, Proust said you could know an awful lot about people from these 20 questions.
Right.
We ran them at the back of the magazine for a quarter of a century.
Okay. So what is your idea of perfect happiness?
Like a roast chicken dinner at home with my wife and kids and their kids.
And what's your greatest fear?
I'm a hugely anxious person. I worry about everything, and I sometimes anything involving anything with my children, or actually any children, any kind of harm towards any child is a constant fear. I can't read about I can't read a novel or a nonfiction book where a child is in any way put in harm's way. I can't watch a movie the same way. So that is a constant fear that I live with every night.
Oh. Did you see a lot of that when you were growing up? Was that?
No, never. No, nothing. Except in hockey. I mean.
Right. Which living person do you most admire?
There's so many people, but the person I will admire as much, or the people, will be the handful of Republicans who stand up and say, okay, this is fucking nuts.
Yeah.
I think it'll happen.
You do?
There can't be that many crazy people out there.
So many things I could say right now. Who's your hero of fiction?
Oh, gosh. Bertie Wooster, Harriet the Spy, and if you hadn't read the book, Flashman, from the Flashman books, which are among my favorites and my father's favorites when I was growing up, and Holden Caulfield.
Ah, okay.
That book still stands up.
Yeah. Which historical figure do you most identify with?
Oh, gosh, probably some lower-ranked jester in a monarchy somewhere in Ruritania or something like that. Somebody juggling balls and just trying to please the king.
How would you like to die?
Oh gosh, I
The
mean,
first questionnaire, people.
well, you know, Cy Newhouse, his father ran the Staten Island Advance and built this huge empire up. And he went to work every day. He came home 87, had dinner with his wife, Mitzi, and had a nightcap after dinner, and went to bed and died. And I thought, that sounds pretty good to me.
And what's your motto?
My motto is, aside from don't touch anything in anybody's house when you're going to the bathroom, prepare for the worst but hope for the best, and always wear underwear. Seriously.
Okay, did Vanity Fair and the New Yorker or the other titles at
Are these audience questions?
Yeah, these
Okay.
are the audience
Okay.
questions, and
Okay.
actually you already answered this. So
Okay.
let's see. Sorry, you're going to have to give me a second to make sure. Okay. Nope, we already answered that. Okay, sorry.
Have we covered everything?
We've kind of covered a lot. Hold on. I'm sure there's some here. Okay, Vanity Fair and Spy were two different species, both wonderful and at the top of their respective food chains. Was your relationship with writers at Spy different from your relationship with writers at Vanity Fair?
That's such a good question. At Spy, basically, it was like running like a boy band. It was like running Menudo at the time. It was just because everybody was like in their like early 20s. This was their first writing job. And I used to say the only thing that trained me for handling all these writers was having 5 kids, having a lot of kids. And so, but that was a different kind of thing. And then moving to Vanity Fair, it was like, because all these writers were established, people like Todd Purdom, who's here tonight, this afternoon, and so many of them. And so that was like going from like running a boy band to running the Metropolitan Opera. And it was, you were dealing with, they didn't have ego so much as they had different needs. So, the our flower budget could have launched a magazine, because Flowers went out just for turning a story in on time, or a bottle of scotch. And there were 2 people who had a fight in the office, and one tried to make it up to the other one by buying them a huge bird cage about this big, which they expensed. And so there was a woman in the office who just sent flowers to herself when she was feeling sad. So it was just, we had probably 50 writers on staff, and it was just trying to, that was the franchise. The writers and the photographers were the franchise. The editor is just there to, try to keep the thing running. It's like, and so this was talent, and my job was to make it as comfortable as possible for them to do their jobs well. And an editor sits down with a writer or a photographer, and their job is to say, what you're going to start, the story you're about to start on now is the single most important story you've ever done in your life. And then they go off and do it, and then you got to sit down with them 3 months later and say, this is the single most important story you've got. And so it's constantly trying to get them to focus on how important this thing is.
Could Vanity Fair have struck the collective nerve in American culture without its great and abundant photography?
No. I think that big consumer magazines like Vanity Fair is a general interest magazine. They are a combination of words and images, and I used to spend a great amount of time on the images. And we had Lanny Leibovitz and Herb Ritts and Helmut Newton and Lord Snowden and Jonathan Becker and Mario Testino and Bruce Weber and Patrick de Marchelier. It was a stable of photographers unlike that's ever been assembled before, with the perhaps exception of Life magazine in the 1940s and 50s. So no, the images were incredibly important, and we paid a lot of attention to them.
Okay, last question. You're given a time machine. Where do you go and why?
Where do I go? Probably the mid 1930s, either in Los Angeles, New York, London, or Paris. I mean, that was the. It's funny, that period between the wars was the, and it was only a 20-year period, but in the middle of that, you had the greatest classic crime fiction. You had, I mean, movies were incredible. Architectural style was incredible. The design of automobiles and airplanes was beautiful. People's clothing was beautiful. Newspapers were abundant. Radio was, electric and like all-consuming. And I thought that must have been just a wonderful period, sort of the mid-1930s, after the Depression, but right up until, the beginning of the war.
Graydon, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Monica.
Yeah, I hope everybody gets his book.
Thank you all.